Okay, where do I even start? This was initially going to be a video about book banning and its effects on a population. But as I was watching a random video of someone criticizing Kindle or like why they were no longer using Kindle, I paused as the creator said the following.
I do not like book piraters. I don't want to hear a single word out of your mouth of, well, some people are poor and some people aren't American. And if you fit into either of those categories, it's perfectly okay to steal books. If that is your opinion, you are in the wrong place. And I'm going to ask you to piss off. It's not okay to steal books, especially since another reason that I got the Kobo device is because they have Overdrive built right in. If you don't know what Overdrive is, it's basically a library app. You just log in with your existing library card and you get a bunch of free ebooks. It's from your local library, which means that the author of those books still gets paid, even though you don't pay any money. Overdrive, yes. Libby, yes. Piracy, no, you scumbag.
And I know that this creator isn't the only person with this opinion.
I do not agree with pirating books. I believe in supporting authors. That's the entire purpose of me having my channel. So please do not come to my channel and ask me to support your pirated book. I will not do it. I have zero problem talking to authors and letting them know about pirated copies of their book because I think that they have every right to make money from the work that they have done. I understand that there are a lot of people who want to read that may not be able to spend money on books. I get that, but there are other ways to do it. That's a whole separate video. I do not support piracy. Please buy books.
There are only two things I can't stand in this world. People who are intolerant of other people's cultures and the Dutch.
And that's how I ended up merging the topic of book banning and book piracy in this video, and particularly my experience living in a global south country. This video is going to give a case for book piracy and why sometimes it's not just an option, but the only option. If you have watched my booktube newbie tag, then you already know that I have fully admitted that book piracy is something I practice. Before you bring in the pitchforks and be angry, I want you to listen because we are both on the same page. Piracy is illegal and it is unethical. But this is a morally grey area, and I want to explain my perspective. And for pure disclosure, by book piracy, I do not mean taking an author's intellectual property and then reposting it on KDP to make money from it or any other platform that would allow you to make money from it, or even plagiarizing the intellectual property by barely changing names. Rather, I mean downloading the book from a third-party platform without any monetary gain for the author. Obviously, both are illegal, but I wanted to differentiate between the two. For example, when I am downloading books from a third-party platform, I am not paying that platform any money. The books are available technically for free. I'm not sure that any of the platforms that I'm using have any ads. I don't recall any of them having any ads. So I don't know if they have any other way through which they make money on the platform itself. But I will give you a bit of a background on how I grew up and what my country is, technically without disclosing the name, and why book piracy, in my case and in the case of many people, is a necessity of sorts. So I am not disclosing where I'm coming from due to safety reasons, and I am worried of the possible repercussions if I were to be found out that I've made this particular video. My country is a constitutional monarchy. That is how it describes itself, and it considers itself a form of democracy, which, in my opinion, is kind of an oxymoron. But what do I know? I would say that it is still a progress from the fact that we've had a dictatorship prior to this. So suffice to say that the last regime was very, very bad. People had to live not only through famines and drought, but on top of that, political prosecution. Ethnical minorities were treated like shit. We had a form of apartheid in some parts of the country, as well as actual discrimination in accessibility of education, health, and overall basic necessities. We had only one accepted language, and the past king had banished all sorts of books, especially philosophical ones, because they were deemed to have dangerous ideologies. If people were allowed freedoms of thought or freedom of thought, then they would be thinking of overthrowing the government, which was not an acceptable outcome. It was terrible because arts became extremely political, and anything that was deemed by the whims of a governmental body and governmental representative to quote unquote inappropriate would then result in the prosecution of the creator. By prosecution, I do mean that they would end up in inhumane solitary confinement prisons where they would be tortured until they die. Only a few people have managed to actually survive these circumstances, and they have fled the country seeking asylum in Europe, the US, or Canada. Now, I grew up only a little in the past regime as the last king died when I was still a child. But I remember when my grandparents would be speaking to my parents over the phone. This was a brand new technology at the time that has just been introduced in my country in the early to mid 90s. I remember how scared they were and how they shush each other to stop speaking out of fear that what they said might be too offensive for a king that cared not for their lives. I remember the day he had passed away, and it was nationally broadcasted on TV, and the country fell into a deafening silence. And I remember seeing all the faces that had an unspeakable joy, as if they were finally granted a piece of freedom. But it only lasted so long. Just because we had a new king appointed did not mean that things suddenly changed. The constitution still had the same inflammatory language that stifled all forms of freedoms. To this day, you cannot make a painting that, from an interpretation, could be considered quote unquote nude or quote unquote lewd in nature. You cannot speak badly of religion or of any governmental body or representative without being considered a threat to the national security of the country. The monarchy, the religion, the government. These are what we ironically call the Holy Trinity. Anything that touches them in a negative sense is obviously a crime. Now, the difference between the two kings is that the one currently in power has allowed philosophical books to be taught, if only to further his own agendas, if only to assert himself as a better leader. We don't have school libraries, but you can find governmental ones nowadays with a very procured selection. And it's always the same books, mostly religious, because that is what's important. They have to make sure you're indoctrinated. That is what's given the monarchy power. They're ordained by God to rule. And what are we but stupid sheep in need of herding? We have governmental bodies who go through every single book yet to be published and then approve it. Even if you're self-publishing, there is a committee that goes through scripts for plays, films, sitcoms, dramas, music, everything. It has to be approved for it to even go into production. And so what you end up with is a bunch of propaganda because the TV and radio channels are owned by the government. Everyone is happy all the time. Nothing is wrong. No news speak of demonstrations on the streets for the unlivable wages we suffer from, or admit the corruption that is running deep in the country. And if you're a citizen journalist who even dares speak the truth, well then, jail. You're threatening the peace of the country. Everything is perfect. I remember my philosophy teacher in high school. He was teaching us whatever he was allowed to, mostly Descartes, I think, therefore I am, and going very superficially over how doubt can lead to certainty. if only to further our own religious indoctrination. A religion I'm quite certain now as an adult that my teacher cared very little for. And I remember his words: "You're lucky. You have access to the internet." When I was studying, which is funny now to hear about it, when I was studying, I had to hide my books and make sure nobody finds them lest I end up gone for good. He urged us to read because he can, and that doubt is good, and critical thinking is your best friend. I was 15 at the time. There was a lot to be doubtful about: my living situation, my sexuality, my religious belief, my future. I was in a constant war with the indoctrination I was living. As an adult, I am quite thankful for the advice he let slip unscripted, as if a hopeful plea for a better generation, a generation hungry for knowledge and that wouldn't submit to the whims and urges of a greedy government. And he was right. The internet was wide open, a space that the government did not care to regulate at that point in time. And while it's true that a lot of people have gotten enamored with the idea of social media and sharing bits and pieces of their lives, it had also opened the door to creative expressions. People made skits that you would have never seen on TV, made music that you would have never heard, and shared thoughts on Facebook posts and Twitter feeds, and they organized demonstrations and boycotted monopolies. It was a third space where we existed outside oppression. It was a breath of fresh air, a much needed outlet where I also participated in artistic expressions and satirical views of politics. But yet again, it was all over so quickly. And as I saw what was happening to all those that got labeled terrorists because of their opinions, not just opinions, but because of their art, I stopped being online. I hated the misinformation that was becoming more and more widespread. I hated the theatrics of social media, and I decided I would no longer exist on social media since I was only allowed to be a passive consumer. I remember the day that I moved to the capital to further my studies, and my mother gave me a tight hug as she attempted not to cry, and she whispered in my ear, "Careful what you say. You're a lot closer to them here." The threat had never really felt so real than in that particular moment, and it became less of what they would do to me and more what would happen to my family. So I bit my tongue and I existed with no opinions to share. Funnily enough, the capital is where I saw one of those bookshops for the first time. Not a legal bookshop, I don't think, just a store in a shady little corner with a small, inconspicuous entrance that barely allowed you a peek of the piles and piles of books it stored. You would find almost any type of book if you only would spare the time to look. Dostoevsky, George Orwell, Sun Tzu, even goddamn Yale James with 50 Shades of Grey, which is insane considering how much sex is a taboo here. Some of these books were in pristine condition. Some of them were secondhand bought, illegally smuggled into the country. And it was raining when I saw 1984 for the first time in my then 23 years of living. It had obviously seen better days with visible wear and tear and notes and highlights from the previous owner. But none of that mattered. It was rarer than any gem. And despite being a student with no income at that time, I shelled the $4 asked by the seller, and I went home happy to have acquired yet another treasure from my small yet growing collection of unique books. It is my own special edition that no company can ever reproduce. Most of the reading I had done, however, had been on my phone or PC. I have been honest with all of you that I participated, and at this point of making the video in January 2025, I am still participating in pirating books as that is the only way for me to acquire them. I understand it is frowned upon, especially by authors themselves, but there is no other way. Books, even in the extremely small selection that I can find in legitimate bookstores, are quite expensive, like groceries for a whole week or more expensive. And whilst sometimes I am lucky enough to spare some income to buy a book, it's often not the case. Most people who consume books here do it in a similar fashion, and most booksellers are selling black market copies. And I know that a lot of people would be outraged by this fact. It's unethical, but it is the lesser of two evils. As I was doing my master's in cultural political science, one of the main topics we discussed ad nauseum was access to culture and by proxy access to books. Would you agree that a person should not read if they cannot afford it? Do you support the oppression that people in countries such as mine are living, and we therefore should not at all consume any literature apart from the one accepted by the government? Do you think that certain arts are only meant for the rich? Do you think artists should adhere to the political standard imposed on them? Or are art production and consumption just a different basic need? The sad fact remains that in my country, less than 2% of the population consumes literature of any kind. And that's depressing. But what do you think that promotes? Book banning, restricting access to public libraries, or even the collections available, making books unaffordable? Well, in my opinion, that promotes ignorance and what I can only describe as willful compliance. I am aware that things are happening across the globe. Not only are organizations in the USA are working tirelessly to ban books left and right, as well as strive to create a countrywide standard that fits their political and religious views, but most countries are moving more right than left in the last few years, which is scary to witness as someone who looks up to these countries who are proud to have freedom of speech and democracy, etc. It is concerning to see that they deem books unsafe for readers of different demographics, and hearing the ridiculous argument that they're protecting these vulnerable societal groups from harmful ideologies and traumatizing truths. But I would argue, as a person who is living in such a world where access to books is heavily restricted, that's what's being done is a disservice, not only to their children, but to everyone else's children and the country as a whole. The fact of the matter is, books are one of the safest ways to address ideas, whether you like them or not. And when you're ignoring the presence of such things like oppression, sexual assault, racism, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, communism, Marxism, socialism, etc., you're not protecting yourself or anyone else for that matter. You're championing ignorance, indoctrination, and blind obedience. You're making it easier for the wrong crowd to take advantage of your kids, including the government. It is foolish to think that the government wants the best for you and your kids. Alternatively, kids specifically should be allowed, obviously depending on their age, their curiosity, and ability to process ideas, to have contact with these uncomfortable topics. The same can be said for adults as well. Nothing good comes out of living in a tight net echo chamber that constantly feeds into your own world beliefs, whether they may be true or not. And wouldn't it be better if we equip people with better understanding of ideologies? Wouldn't it give a better chance for kids and teens, a better and knowing when they're being sexually harassed or coerced into doing something they don't want, understanding racism, which very much still exists in the world. Just because you ignore an issue doesn't mean it stops existing. Wouldn't it be better if we let them learn to speak up, not only for themselves, but for their friends and classmates, and just have them know in general how to deal with certain situations, however uncomfortable that may be? And I chose the sexual assault example because it is an uncomfortable reality. It is something that I and my sister have encountered. And our mother, even though she's aware as a woman in a deeply sexually oppressed country that sexual harassment is a thing, she has never really discussed it with us. The topic of sexuality is a taboo, pure and simple. And because of the accusational victim blaming societal norm we have, neither me nor my sister have ever confided in her, even when things got worse. Look, nobody wants to see anyone, much less a child, go through something horrific. I'm sure my mother's intentions were to protect us. However, not knowing about it caused more harm than good to us, both as children and as teens, who unfortunately had to witness pedophilic behavior from both strangers and people in our circle who we thought could be trusted. So, my questions to these book banners are: why are you encouraging ignorance and victimization of our own children by limiting knowledge? Why do you think that banning books that might be uncomfortable to read is somehow more traumatizing than living through that specific scenario? And why would you, as a parent, risk your child not trusting you or fearing you would overreact if they told you they were struggling with something? Whether that is harassment or they're sexually exploring and they don't know who they are. And this is just one scenario with which books could help a lot more mitigating dangers and serving as precautions. Books can not only be a window through which you witness other experiences, but also a mirror that reflects your own. It is a beautiful thing to be heard and seen. Books are a form of third space where we can be our most vulnerable selves. But that's not the only reason why banning books is bad. I can tell you firsthand that sciences are really behind in here as well because of that, especially in fields like psychology and psychiatry. It is 2025. Homosexual attraction is still considered sexual deviancy in here, with conversion therapy being an acceptable form of treatment. The government criminalizes same sex attraction with up to 3 years in prison. And that's not the worst part. The worst part is they out you in public before you even have the chance to stand in court. It is then easy for a fanatic who is both vindicated by law and religion to take matters in their own hands and, quite simply, end you. Then, when it comes to autism, it's the atrocious work and support of Autism Speaks is affecting the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. ADHD is considered attention seeking behavior disorder in kids, and on the off chance you find a psychiatrist willing to diagnose you with it as an adult, there is no form of medication. All forms of medication related to ADHD are illegal substances. All because my country rejects knowledge that doesn't align with their views. This is a disaster. I don't need to explain how dangerous this is and how many lives it affects. And most people are not even aware of this because they are struggling to survive day-to-day life, as a huge portion of the population are suffering from acute poverty. And to sum up the portion, I want to share one of my favorite quotes by Martin Luther King Jr. Nothing in the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity. And then we move on to talk about the other side of this censorship coin, where piracy resides. Piracy is the product of censorship, restrictions, and inability to afford books, movies, and other artistic and academic mediums. It is easier for someone from the global north to forget how privileged they are to have libraries in their communities and enough spare income to spend on books. Obviously, I'm not saying that everyone in the global north is rich or can afford basic library access or that their libraries have a wide selection of books, since sadly, not all libraries are created equal. But I am addressing those who overlook the complexity of this discussion by disregarding people like myself, individuals shaped by their countries, societies, and economies. By painting us as villains, they reduce a nuanced issue to an oversimplified narrative. It's easy to sit on the other side of a screen and tell people not to pirate books. It's easy to say that there are countless other options like Kindle Unlimited, Libby, Audible, etc., etc. But that doesn't matter when those services are not even available in my country. Kindle Unlimited costs something around $13 USD last time I checked, which with the conversion of 10 for each $1 plus fees, it would be around 140 of my currency. Let's assume that I can afford to spend 140 for that service. It doesn't exist. Amazon is not offering Kindle Unlimited in my country. Libby is mostly English speaking countries, I believe, and as far as I can tell, it's region restricted. There is not a single actual physical library here through which I can borrow books. I cannot take the book outside of the library premises, even on the off chance they have something I am interested in reading. And we don't have anything like Barnes and Nobles. Most bookstores are small owned businesses. They have very restrictive selections because they have to abide by the law. I can order books online, but that would cost me a literal fortune. And let's crunch out the numbers. Onyx Storm by Rebecca Yaros is a book that has just come out at this point of me recording about approximately 10 days ago or so. On Amazon, it would cost me almost 70 USD to buy the book, and it would cost me around 35 USD to ship it. That's $100 for just that. And then when it arrives to my country, I will have to pay a tax of 100% to 150 of what I paid total. That means it will cost me another $100 to $150 for a total of $200 to $250 for a single hard book, for a single hardback book. And I'm sorry, this is ridiculous. You can co-rent with that amount of money where I live. It is a fortune we cannot afford as a population. Now, I do have a Kindle device, courtesy of my partner who sent it to me from abroad. Because again, if I want to buy the same Kindle Paperwhite device, used, not even brand new, I have to spend something around $300 for it. Now, when I can, and I emphasize the word can, I do buy books on the Kindle store. The most recent one is Adventure Mage by Julian Greystoke, which I have bought for myself as a birthday present. And this should show you how much hard it is for me to spend money on books. The books that I do get from book dealers are still acquired with real money that I spend for those copies, whether they are legitimate or not. They look legitimate to me, and I know for certain, I know 100% that none of the revenue goes to the author because this is the black market of books. They are smuggled in. I don't know how they buy the books. I don't have knowledge on that. I just know that these are not regulated by the government, and therefore they're not regulated by the companies themselves that are publishing these books. Now, if I were in a better situation, if I had similar financial and political freedoms that many of the people who are judging book piracy, I would love nothing more than to support the authors I love. So I only ask for grace and open-mindedness when you meet someone who's proclaiming that they are pirating books. And before I end the video, I want to share a few tidbits. Despite everything that I've said in this video, I still consider myself more privileged than most people in my country. Because even though education is free, a lot of people cannot even afford the basic necessities to send their kids to school. They are forced to work at an early age to help support their families. I grew up in that poor community where we didn't have running water or electricity, and I saw kids who were my age pulled out of school. I am more fortunate because I managed to snag a couple scholarships throughout my student's life that allowed me to further my studies, both in the capital of my country and in an international setting where I witnessed experiences that were different than mine, and my way of thinking was challenged by new ideologies. I have gotten my master's degree studying under some of the most influential sociologists and art advocates in the world, and they understood the nuance of this topic, and they gave me and my classmates access to countless books to give us an equal opportunity and to be better equipped at fighting these injustices. Keep in mind that my story is just one of many, and that it can be a lot worse. My country, despite it being very oppressive, is not riddled with war. Whether the point of this video was to show that when you limit access to books, movies, arts, and knowledge, people find a way. People will always find a way to get their hands on the things they want because there is an innate need within us to create and consume art as well in whatever form it may be. And I fully understand that artists work hard to create their art. As an artist myself, I have profound respect for them, but I think the fundamental idea that people pirating books are stealing possible income from artists is wrong. I don't have access to your books in the first place because my country restricts their sale. On the rare occasion that I do stumble upon one, it is simply beyond my reach financially. In other words, you cannot lose that which you never had to begin with. If you are someone who is doing countless book hauls, sitting behind a luxurious library with wide selection of books, do not shame those less fortunate than you. There's a lot wrong with the publishing industry, but the form of piracy I spoke of in this video is the product of a much larger issue. Please support creators from the global south and less fortunate communities around the world, because I promise you that I have never met someone who is pirating a book to save money or to spite an author. It is sadly just a necessity for us. Now, thank you for watching this video. I know it is very different from everything I've posted. If you have a question, you can drop it in the comment section, and if I have enough questions to warrant a second video on the topic, I will do that. If you have a story as a person who is pirating books, you can email it to me, and if I have enough stories, I might do some of that to uplift voices of marginalized groups who are suffering from access to, like, restrictive access to books and culture in general. For the time being, I have linked a few creators who talk about the matter in a more intelligent and articulated way, and I want to thank you again for your patience with me. See you in the next one.
Book pirating is a complex issue. It's so easy for y'all to come on the internet and be like,
I'm against crime, and I'm not ashamed to admit it.
something being illegal does not always mean that that thing is immoral. There is moral grayness to this situation. There is nuance to this conversation. And I am of the mind that if you do not have the access, the means to access these books, then no purchase was ever going to be made anyway by the people who don't have the means, and therefore nothing's really been lost to the author because the person was never going to be able to spend money on it in the first place.